Okay, so the regeneration that's specific to a sugar bush includes at least these three things, and there may be some other things, and you can share those thoughts as we get into the questions. First, you want to limit the loss of production. So maple producers are unique as a woodlot owner, and I do a lot of work with woodlot owners. Most of them are not thinking, many of them never think about an economic return. Those that do think about an economic return think about it typically in multi-year increments. So every 10 or 15 or 20 years, or maybe once during their ownership, in contrast to maple producers who are thinking about income on an annual basis. So that's going to impact the choice of harvesting systems that you use. So it's going to limit those. There are fewer that you're probably going to want to consider. Diversity is important. So the greater the variety of tree species you can establish is going to be helpful, particularly from a forest health and a defoliation insect perspective. There's some other things as well. But you're going to focus on sugar maple and red maple, and these have attributes that align those species with certain soil conditions. Sugar maple I think of as fairly finicky, in that it doesn't like, I mean, you can grow it on dry soils, you can grow it on wet soils. It doesn't perform well there. It needs reasonably moist and fairly fertile soils in order to perform well. The other downside, if you will, of these two species or issue we have to deal with is that deer preferentially browse both red and sugar maple. So deer protection from deer is probably going to be an issue for you. And then you have infrastructure. And by that, I mean tubing systems such as you see in the picture. So if you're harvesting trees, you're probably, unless you're doing it yourself and you're willing to take the time to be meticulous and work within the tubing system, you're probably going to want to at least remove or pull in all of your lateral lines and probably many of your main lines, if not all of your main lines. So that's something that you need to plan for. The other part of the planning is how much time or the duration of the harvest. So if you're harvesting in order to create this patch of regeneration and your tubing system's down, you obviously want to have the tubing system down for the shortest amount of time and then reinstall it so that you can make sure you can catch up with, you can be ready for the season when it starts. So let me just, I want to just jump back to this slide. I forgot to turn on the recording, so just the people that are watching the recording will see these factors as I mentioned them. So now I'm going to put you all on the spot in a way. Before we get into the questions, we had been contacted by one of our colleagues in Vermont that was interested in knowing the types of management that maple producers do in the woods. So I'm going to ask you, if you would please, to type in the chat window. So there's a little button on the bottom of your screen that says chat. I guess maybe in Apple's it's at the top, but somewhere on your screen there should be a button that says chat. We'll open a chat window, and if you would please just type in how many taps you have, the state and county, and then what you've done, those things you've completed, not what you're planning to do, but what you've completed in your sugar bush over whatever the last 5 or 10 years, let's say. So I just give some examples here. These, I'm not asking you to respond to each of these, but just maybe you've thinned. And when I say thinning, I'm talking about cutting live trees. I remember once I talked with a maple producer and they said they thinned their woods, and we talked at greater length, and I came to find out that they would only cut dead trees, which is not, is not the way most people would use the word thin when they think about thinning their sugar bush. Maybe you've planted trees, maybe you do annual health inspections, you mark the boundaries, you make trails, you refurbish trails, you control erosion, you fertilize. So whatever it is, if you please take it, and just do this over the course of the remaining hour, just share some information if you would. so that we can share that with our colleague who's trying to work on this. So number of taps, state and county, and then what you've done. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing and we'll come back to our discussion. So if somebody has questions, I'd be happy to hear them, or maybe you have some thoughts, or I talked about the primary factors and things that were specific to sugar bushes. Maybe you'd like to expand on those lists. What's on your mind? Has anyone? So let me see the question. Has anyone spent time looking at seedlings and thinking about either the number of seedlings or what might be limiting them? Anybody spend some time pondering that question?
About how tall will the deer leave the seedlings alone? I mean, how tall does it have to be before they won't bother it anymore?
Okay, great question. So it depends a little bit on what you might have as snow depth, but usually we think of 5 feet as a minimum. Some people will say 6 feet. So that's a fairly significant height for a seedling, and it may vary a little bit if you have a high density of seedlings and a low density of deer, or and it's not really the number of deer, it's the number of deer relative to other things they have to eat. So if you're in an agricultural area, then you can potentially, the farmers will feed the deer for some of the year. So you may be able, they may stop browsing heavily on those seedlings as they get into the 3 to 4 foot range, but they could still have an impact on those. So good question. Oh, so I know there's the follow-up to that is how long does it take for a seedling to get to be 5 or 6 feet tall? And that depends a lot on sunlight and a lot on how those seedlings are started. So we have some tagged seedlings we have a deer management program that's called AVID. And let me type that website in. aviddeer.com is a protocol that we developed where we provide numbered tags to woodlot owners and maple producers, and we have a system where you go out and you pick your seedlings and put a tag on them, and then you measure the height, and then every year you go back and measure the height. And if deer are having an impact, then your seedlings aren't growing. If deer are not having an impact and the seedlings have enough sunlight, then they'll grow. And it's ideally set up so you have some seedlings are protected and some seedlings are vulnerable to deer. So where we have relatively heavy shade, we'll get not complete shade, but you can see some blue sky when you look up through the canopy. We'll get protected sugar maple seedlings will grow maybe 3 inches a year. So 3 inches a year is a foot every 4 years. So you're looking at 20 years at that rate of growth. Now, when a seedling gets to be 3 feet tall, it's got a better root system and it can grow faster, but you're looking probably 10 to 15 years under partial shade before a maple seedling may be getting above the reach of deer. In another area where we have more or less full sunlight, we've had maple seedlings grow 20 inches a year. So there you're looking at 3 or 4 years. So sunlight, when my factors, I said managing sunlight is a huge determinant of how successful you can be. So Wayne has a question about shelterwood harvesting. Do you want to go ahead and ask your question, Wayne?
Yeah, I about 4 years ago, I had a shelterwood thinning that I left all the maples and oaks and removed the hemlock that was dying off. And the following 2 years, I have broadcast several feed bags full of maple seeds and several bushels of acorns. And it looks like all I got now is about 5 foot high multiflora rose.
Oh no. So I guess two or three things come to mind with a shelterwood harvest. Ideally, and it doesn't always happen ideally, as you found, ideally the harvesting coincides with a good seed year and you're able to get seeds naturally established. As a precursor to that, what's sometimes recommended is that you do what's called a preparatory cut. So a shelterwood is a process of leaving about usually be 25 to 40 trees per acre, depending upon size, that provides shelter and adapted shade so sunlight can get into the forest floor so that seedlings can establish and grow. That works best when you have some seedlings already established. And so oftentimes there's a preparatory cut that leaves a relatively intact canopy but cleans the kind of the mid-story layers. That allows enough sunlight to get to the forest floor to trigger germination of seeds that are there, but without allowing for development of there's some early successional species like pin cherry and aspen that can come in when you allow too much sunlight. And then if you have a presence of what are called interfering vegetation, such as multiflora rose or American beech or barberry or honeysuckle or striped maple, those need to be controlled early on so they're not competing with the understory. So if you currently have a situation where it's dominated, you have like a closed canopy at 5 feet high of multiflora rose, that's going to be shading any seedlings that might be in there. We had a situation at the Arnott Forest near Ithaca where we did a shelterwood harvest without that preparatory cut. We put up a slash wall to keep deer out. But what we didn't expect was we'd never worked in the absence of deer, and so we weren't prepared for what happened, which was a proliferation of red elderberry. And we'd seen red elderberry here and there, but deer kept it in check. So this is about a 12-acre shelterwood harvest that is almost a continuous cover of elderberry. Now, the good news is that the harvest happened, we did the harvest in late summer, early fall in 2017, which was for us a very good seed year for sugar maple. And so we have 3-year-old maple seedlings beneath this canopy of red elderberry. I'm not sufficiently familiar with the ecology of red elderberry to be able to predict what's going to happen to it. So we're going to go in, this is an experimental area. We'll go in and we'll experimentally remove red elderberry and whatever else might be competing with maple seedlings on about a third of our permanent plots so that we can see how, if you add sunlight to those seedlings, they should grow, but we want to be able to monitor how they grow relative to the seedlings that don't have that release. So from your perspective, it's a challenge. If you don't do anything, the multiflora rose is probably going to persist, and the multiflora rose is probably there because you may have an overabundance of deer. So oftentimes when we get proliferation of non-palatable species, the species the deer won't eat, like multiflora rose and beech, is because we have a deer problem. And we don't need to have very many deer if there's limited alternative food sources. So, the two, I guess I would start with a couple of. So, Wayne, how big is the area that was harvested?
It's about 5 acres.
Okay.
And when the stumps are too high to get through there efficiently with a brush hog,
Right.
I can get most of it. But I was wondering if I just went through, once it got all leafed out and did some glyphosate, would it get down and kill any seedlings underneath?
Okay, good question. So, so let me answer the first question, then I'll add a second question that I'll also answer. Multiflora rose is relatively sensitive to glyphosate, and sugar maple is relatively insensitive. But small seedlings are sensitive, and I'm not going to go in. There's a much longer story associated with that, with a little pilot study I did, where I showed that you could really easily kill sugar maple seedlings with glyphosate. So, but the good news is that, and this assumes that you're not an organic maple producer, because this would negate that. And so, for other people that are organic maple producers, the glyphosate's not, to my knowledge, is not an option. Multiflora rose and the other non-native shrubs, so that might include buckthorn and barberry and bush honeysuckle. Those typically leaf out early in the spring, and they leaf out earlier than our native plant species do. So I have on one occasion gone into our sugar bush, and this was in late April, and it was with primarily multiflora rose, and used a relatively heavy concentrated, I don't remember what the label stated for the product I was using, about 6 or 8% active ingredient. And before the maple leafed out, but the multiflora rose was leafed out, and I did a foliar spray, and I got very good kill on the multiflora rose, like 100% kill on multiflora rose. And because there was no sugar maple leafed out, there was no impact on anything that was not leafed out. So glyphosate does not work through bark tissue or through buds, and if you keep it, so we know obviously you're not going to spray it willy-nilly. If you focus it on some maple trees, then, if you focus it on the multiflora rose, you should be able to control those without damage to the maple seedlings. I'll be an optimist and say that hopefully you have some maple seedlings beneath the multiflora rose, but you'd have to go and do an inspect the area to find out. So the second part of the question is why you have those multiflora rose dominating. My guess is you have a deer population that's eating everything else. So there's two things you can do. You could do a small area, like a quarter of an acre or a tenth of an acre, and put up some fencing. So do this herbicide treatment and then put up some fencing. You don't need to remove the multiflora rose, other than it's gonna persist for 3 or 4 years probably, and it's gonna, if you're putting up fencing in these little areas, it's going to catch on that fencing and be frustrating. But it's not, just having the dead stems there is not in itself problematic from a maple seedling perspective. We developed a technique, we call it low-cost fencing. We use and we did this project primarily to help provide tools to maple producers that were trying to regenerate. And it's low cost because you can do the work yourself, and the materials are relatively inexpensive. And you don't put up any fence posts. You use your maple trees. You put a block of wood on the tree. We used pressure treated 2x4s, usually about, a piece that's about 12 inches long. And to prevent the wood from splitting, we'd drill a hole, and then you get a fender washer, which is a large diameter washer that has a hole in it, and we would put a long rust-proof nail in. So if you can find a smooth shank, 3.5-inch galvanized nail, that works well. And then that's what you attach a piece of high tensile wire. So the same high tensile wire that you use for your main lines, with a little plastic clip, or just however you want to attach that wire to that block. And then you stretch it around on the outsides of trees and then put it under tension. Put that about 4.5 feet off the ground. You can order a roll of black plastic mesh from a place called, so I get it from 2 different locations. Let me type the names into the chat window. One is Gempler's, and the other is Deer Busters or something like that. So you can get a roll, a 10-foot roll that comes on a cardboard spindle. Take your chainsaw, cut it in half at 5 feet, and then use hog rings to attach that 5-foot plastic to that high tensile wire. There should be a little bit of apron that you leave on the ground, and you can weight that down. Deer will happily go under. And if you're thinking that, well, deer can obviously jump over 4.5-foot tall fence, it's true, but in a small area, if deer can see the fence on the other side, they get this kind of 2-dimensional thing going on, and then when they get inside, they feel trapped, and so they jump out. So we've done this. We've had very good success at limiting deer impact in these small areas. Now what we did not test was a long, narrow fenced area. So, maybe something that's 30 feet wide and 100 feet long is going to be 3,000 feet. That's not quite about 1/10 of an acre. So maybe longer than that. If I do my math right, yeah, 3,000 square feet. So maybe longer than that, or, these small circles. So that the small areas we didn't have problems in. So if you do this small area, you can pilot test. What I'm proposing is as a hypothesis that deer are preferentially browsing species like sugar maple. That maple were not able to take advantage of the sunlight that you gave them, but the multiflora rose were. So you need to level the playing field by controlling the sunlight that's blocked by the multiflora rose and providing sunlight and protection to the maple seedlings. Does that make sense?
Yep.
So, and I mean, you could go ahead and do it on the 5 acres. If you do it on the 5 acres, the 4.5 fence is not going to be tall enough. You're probably going to have to go with about an 8-foot roll of plastic mesh with a 1-foot apron. And when you go those taller heights, you need a wire at the top and at the bottom. The wire is inexpensive. If you put a wire at the bottom as well as the top with those blocks of wood, you'll have better success. But if you're just going to try it on a 1/4 of an acre, you could probably get away with a single wire at the top.
Okay.
So, all right. Jody says, we tried deer buster mesh around our elderberry bushes strung with high tensile wire. The deer busted through the mesh, 70 feet by 140 feet. So necessary to do 2 layers of mesh. So you're kind of pushing me to the limit of my deer fence knowledge, Jody. And you're welcome to turn your microphone on if you want. You can clarify some of this. Where we have been working with our deer buster mesh fence, it's been a low, what's the word that's used? Kind of a low priority target for the deer. So the deer are in the woods, they see woods on the other side. It's not a high value target for them. A colleague of of mine and Aaron's and Adam's is Dr. Paul Curtis. He's a wildlife damage specialist, and he's worked with fencing around apple orchards, which is a high value target for deer, and the plastic mesh in those cases doesn't work. I think they end up going with a woven wire system.
Did you say with a voltage wire system, electric?
So I don't, we have, so that would help. And we did that in the presentation that was, I posted online. There was I think a picture of the plastic mesh that we put around our sugar bush. It was a 30-acre harvest, and that included a high electrified strand that was about 30 inches off the ground. And then on top of that, we put bait capsules on the electric fence and put a scent in there that drew the deer in. We put a capsule about every 50 to 75 feet. The deer smell, it's like an apple scent. The deer come in to smell. It sounds mean, but the deer come in to smell it. Their little brown, black, wet nose touches that electric fence, and we've got video footage that says they find that uncomfortable. So that creates a psychological barrier. So the fence is a physical barrier. The electric strand is a psychological barrier. By also having that electric wire about 30 inches off the ground, it creates a dual cycle. It's both a physical pain and psychological pain rather, and it's a double layer of mechanical. So you've got the layer, first strand, and then you have the plastic mesh fence. And that adds like this 3-dimension that the deer struggle with. But the 3-dimension in and of itself isn't effective if you have a really high value target. So in apple orchards, some of you may have seen those fences that they put up on an angle. They have high tensile strands that go up. They have whatever 6 or 8 strands of high tensile there on an angle, so it gives that kind of 3-dimension. Paul Curtis described video footage they have of deer standing parallel to those high tensile strands and walking sideways and getting in as close as they can get standing up, and then leaping vertically and jumping on the inside to get to the apples. So this time of year and when fruit are being produced, deer have 2 things on their mind: reproduction and feeding. So if there's a high value target like elderberries or apples, then it's going to be harder to keep them out. The benefit with the forest is that the deer are standing in forest, they're looking at forest. I don't know if they can smell sugar maple seedlings on the inside that don't exist on the outside of the fence. I can't answer that.
I did have one other question. We noticed some gypsy moths around the house, and definitely heavily infesting sugar maple in the front yard. Walked out around the side and did notice a little bit of the egg trailings. Haven't really inspected all through the woods, but is there something we should be actively doing right now?
So I guess the first thing is to, what the gypsy moth egg masses look like. I would go into your sugar bush and look for those. Where are you? What state and county are you in?
We're in Chautauqua County, New York.
Okay, so I was in Wyoming County, which is pretty close to Chautauqua, at a sugar maple woods walk earlier in October, and it had a lot of gypsy moth egg masses in the sugar bush. So that's concerning. I guess you have 2 strategies, and I'll probably need to defer to check with our forest entomologist. I have not worked with control of gypsy moth. So 2 things come to mind. One is that there are there are pests that will control gypsy moth. So there's a virus and a fungus. And I don't know if the friendly fly does gypsy moth, or if it just does forest ant caterpillar, but there's a virus and a fungus that will effectively control gypsy moth from multi-year outbreaks. So that's the good news. And if there's been some low-level gypsy moth or some other forest defoliators in the area, like, then those populations of those predators will have started to build up. If it's been a while since there's been gypsy moth, those predators will arrive somehow, but it may take a year or two for their populations to grow enough to have a significant impact on the gypsy moth population. So if you have, if there's a full outbreak of gypsy moth, they'll be defoliating trees in the spring after your maple season. So next spring's maple season is not going to be impacted. But if there's an outbreak and your sugar maple trees are defoliated, then there's going to be problems the following spring. So the only thing that you could do to anticipate that would be to, and I'll let Adam and Aaron, maybe they know, or some others here, there's a insecticide that's known as BT, Bacillus thuringiensis, that is toxic to young, so early larval stages of caterpillars, all caterpillars. And it's sprayed aerially, and you would need to start talking now with aerial applicators to see about getting your sugarbush treated. They probably have a minimum size that they will treat, so depending upon how big of an area you need treated, you may need to see if there are some neighbors that are willing to go in with you to meet some minimum threshold. We had the impact of a defoliation it's going to be, so if there's a full outbreak, it's really dramatic and it's scary. We had a forest tent caterpillar outbreak in about 2006 or 2007. The first year of the full outbreak, we had essentially, so in the areas where, and prior, so this was going back into the 90s before any of us were involved in managing the Arnott Sugarbush, there was some harvesting done and the logger was told to cut everything but the sugar maples. And so that created essentially a monoculture that is prime real estate for defoliating insects. And so the forest tent caterpillar got into that area, and it completely defoliated the entire sugarbush. So you'd walk in there was not a leaf left on those trees. There's some red maple that the forest tent caterpillars don't impact. Another area, and the story is about why it's important to have diversity. In other areas where we had a mixture of species, the impact overall was less and the impact of the sugar maple was less. So those other species diluted the impact of the defoliation.
It is a fairly diverse forest. We've got, hemlock and birch and cherry and a number of other things going on back there, oak. And we haven't really, like I said, haven't really noticed it so much in the woods, but it was very obvious on the big sugar maple in the front yard. First we saw the egg mass, then realized why the center of that tree had some dead branches, and it was probably early summer when we noticed, just huge chomping pieces missing from, excuse me, from the leaves. So what can we expect if they were in that stage in the summer? Do they then become caterpillars in the spring and continue to spread, or did I hear you say they skip?
So they will, so the larvae, the eggs hatch in the spring, they travel up the trees. So I haven't studied gypsy moth in depth in a while, so I may be off a little bit on my details, but I have a fact sheet that I handed out at this woods walk that we did in October, and I'll send that to Aaron and we can post that on the Cornell Maple site. The eggs hatch in the spring, they travel up the tree, they start feeding on the leaves as they emerge. and the larvae go through these developmental stages where they get progressively bigger and bigger. What the BT or the Bacillus thuringiensis does is it's a I think it's like a crystalline structure that the larvae ingest, and it kind of disembowels the caterpillar. So it's not, if you're a caterpillar, it's not a pleasant way to go. If you're a maple producer, you may feel some joy in knowing that they're suffering. But so the caveat is that it's not specific to gypsy moth. Any caterpillar that's feeding at that time will have the same fate. So probably, I mean, we need an entomologist to sound off on this. My guess is the number of caterpillars that are impacted is relatively small of other species. But it has to be, the treatment has to be early in the development of those caterpillars. If you wait until you can see that there's a problem, the caterpillars are too big for the Bacillus thuringiensis to be effective. So it's a little bit of a gamble, right? So you pay for the aerial treatment, and you may or may not ever develop a problem. So timing matters. There are some techniques that you can use to estimate the number of forest tent caterpillar egg masses and then convert that into a likelihood for defoliation. I'm not aware that there are good estimates for gypsy moth, but I haven't looked into that. What we found after that first year of significant defoliation, the next year our sap sugar concentrations were less than 1%. So they were usually 0.6 to 0.9 sugar concentrations. If you have really good reverse osmosis, I mean, it takes a lot of sap, so your production is going to be down, but you may not feel it in the evaporator if you've got a good reverse osmosis, and you can concentrate that from whatever it is, 0.6 or 0.9 up to something that's more workable for you.
All right, thank you.
So yeah, I mean, so keep an eye on it. Look for the caterpillars, and what you'll see, if the fungus kills them, you'll get the caterpillars will stay. The full body attaches to the bark, to the stem of the tree. If it's the virus kills them, then the front legs, the lower legs stay attached to the tree, and the front legs detach, and the bodies kind of bend backwards off the trees. So if you're seeing that happening, then you have the pathogens that will help control the gypsy moth, and usually that shuts it down. So and if it's a cool, wet spring, that's good for the fungus. Aaron and Adam, I was on kind of the edge of my knowledge base on gypsy moth. If I missed anything or misspoke, please correct me.
That's more than I'm able to add, so
Okay.
I won't add anything else.
I will. Go ahead, Jody.
Did I hear you say that? I'm sorry. Did I hear you say that if we have the just naturally have the right virus or funguses in the woods, that we'll see dead larvae attached to the tree?
Correct.
Either partway attached or okay. We'll look for that before we attempt anything like aerial spray.
Yeah. So you won't see that until the summertime or early summertime. So you might see defoliation. So the best case scenario is that there's a slow buildup of the gypsy moth population that allows for a buildup of the predators. And in that case, that creates a balance. And there's always, I mean, if you went out and you looked for it, you would always find gypsy moth in the woods, and you'd always find forest tent caterpillars in the woods. But those populations don't reach outbreak proportions. This year was droughty, and the trees are under stress. And so next year, those trees, if they're defoliated, that's a double stress situation, and those double stresses are really hard on trees. So, keep your fingers crossed for a moist spring, if there's a full defoliation, the trees will try to push out another set of leaves. The leaves will be smaller, they'll have less vibrant green colors, and they'll produce less sugar. And so that's why the following year you'll get a reduction in the sugar output in the sap. So
Correct me if I'm wrong, Peter, but the gypsy moth typically prefers oaks over maples. Is that correct? Now they certainly do will go to maples, right? But
so the gypsy moth has a fairly, they do, and that's where they're kind of the fame and fortune of gypsy moth was in the central Appalachian oak forests. And there were, this was in the 80s before the virus and the fungus. So the virus and the fungus I know work on the forest ant caterpillar. At least one of them also works on gypsy moth. And so there were thousands of acres of oak forest that died before those predators emerged. But now these predators are here, and the scale of the outbreak is much smaller. So it's interesting though that Jody saw some in Western New York, and I saw some in Western New York. So that'll be something we need to keep an eye on.
I haven't noticed them in northern New York, at least within our forest, but they could be out there. But she did mention that she had some oaks, so hopefully if you do have
they'll
outbreak, they'll go to the oaks.
Yeah, the oaks will take it on the chin. So good question. So I will either this evening or first thing in the morning, I'll send that file to Aaron, and so right now our website is down. The Cornell Maple website was down at least before this session started. So assuming it's back up, then Aaron will be able to load that and put it as a resource there. I mean, there's a lot. If you're eager to learn, you can do a Google search for forest gypsy moth control, and there's thousands of pages of resources out there. Any other questions that people have? So I'll say it's a good idea when you're out in the woods to just kind of, it's as maple producers, and I do the same thing when I'm in the maple woods. I'm looking at the trees, I'm looking at the crowns, thinking about tap density and things like that. But periodically, just look down and see what you see on the ground in terms of maple seedlings or other seedlings. Maple seedlings are particularly vulnerable to deer browsing. Maple seedlings can tolerate very heavy shade. Tolerate is different than thrive. We've got one area at the Arnott Forest. It's I think one of the prettiest places we have in the Arnott. It's an old agricultural field that's probably 60 or 70 years old. And the maple seedlings have come in, and there's a carpet of them, almost a solid carpet of sugar maple that's about a foot high. But it's looked the same for 20 years, and it's because deer just go through and browse the tops off of all those maple seedlings. And if you look at them, you see that there's a lot of these multi-stemmed tops that are coming off those trees. So, and that's from a timber production perspective, that obviously is problematic. Many of these have 3 or 4 or 5 or 7 tops or tips. And if you grew a 7-stem maple tree is probably not the ideal tree for a sugarbush tree either. So a couple 2 or 3 stems maybe isn't bad, but that's a lot. So Fred says, how many hours of sunlight do seedlings need? That's a great question. I don't have an immediate response to that. So more is better. I'll punt with that one. there are some statistics. So there are, if photosynthesis is limited by something like, I'll say 15 to 20%, and Adam, feel free to jump in here if you've got numbers more closer to the tip of your tongue. Yeah, so if there's sunlight's limited by, I'll say 20%, there's a reduction in photosynthetic output of the seedlings of the tree. And a closed canopy, hardwood canopy will reduce sunlight on the forest floor to about 5% of maximum. So on the forest floor in a closed canopy, you're getting very little sunlight. So when we think about these small, so if you're trying to regenerate a sugar maple forest, you would, particularly for a sugar bush, where you want to retain as many large trees as you can for production purposes, for syrup production purposes, you might be doing relatively small openings that are on the order of what's called one tree height. So if you have an average tree height of 70 feet, you would create in a textbook, you create a circular opening that's 70 feet wide, or maybe that's a tree or a tree and a half. Now, you don't have to cut all of the trees in that circular opening. You can leave a few maple trees, your best maple trees in that area, but if your purpose is trying to regenerate, then you need to have enough sunlight that you can get it on the forest floor. So looking up through the canopy, you want to go from, say, 100% cover to probably 50 or 60% cover inside that one tree height opening or less. If you can get down to 30 or 40%, that's even better. And, earlier Wayne was talking about a shelter wood. With the shelter wood, you're probably down to 40 or 50% cover over the entire area, which if there's a lot of maples in there, then you may be cutting more maples than what you want to reduce in your production. If there's other species that you can work with, then you can cut those. But again, we're not trying to create a monoculture. That's gonna cause you frustration further down the road. So I don't think that didn't answer your question in terms of hours. It's more about like the space that you have that you can provide to seedlings.
So what I was thinking about is you could have, if you've done some general releasing, you could have sunlight on the floor at 9 a.m. and it's in the shade at 2 p.m. So
Yeah.
So is like a morning or an afternoon sun going to be enough to grow some seedlings?
It'll help. It'll certainly help. I can't give you a specific number. And unless you have a fairly large opening, if you think about an opening in the canopy, you're going to have the most sunlight on the north side. Let's say you put a perfect circle opening in the canopy that's half an acre in size or a quarter of an acre in size. The majority of the sunlight is going to be on the north side because the sun is going to be from the south casting down, and the trees that are on the south side of the opening are going to be casting a shade. And so the majority of the sunlight is going to be on the north side of that opening. So, I mean, that doesn't help you because you always have a south side, right? And you always have a north side. So you can, one way to do that maybe would be to make some more linear openings that are north and south. If you did a narrow opening that's east and west, the whole forest floor might never get any significant amount of sunlight.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yep.
So, I mean, if you could get 4 hours of sunlight, that'd be great. If you had 8 hours, it would be even better. And I would say that afternoon sun is going to have more energy, photosynthetic energy than morning sun would. But I'm pretty much guessing on that.
So I was thinking about buying saplings and planting them where the sunlight is after I've done my releasing. So does that make sense at all?
You can do that. Planting trees is a lot like work. Um, so if you do it, you're going to want to make sure you protect them, because the other problem with small openings is that deer recognize. So there's going to be a vegetative response in a small opening.
Yeah.
Those small openings are going to attract deer. So they're deer
Yeah.
magnets, and what might have been a diffuse deer impact across an area is going to be concentrated. So you will, if you put, and we did, it was not as part of a sugar bush, but we did some small patch openings to test the effectiveness of fencing. This was 20 years ago. And in the small openings where there was no fencing, we had zero seedling growth, like zero, because the deer would zoom in and just, I mean, we couldn't even grow beech in those openings. So it was that much of a magnet for the deer.
That's all the
So,
information. Thank you.
sure. So Steve says, are other tree species preferentially browsed relative to sugar maple? 70 acres in Steuben. So if you're seeing ironwood browsed preferentially, so Steve, you could maybe go ahead and turn on your microphone. So it says here, there's quite a lot of ironwood given the choice. Deer seem to prefer ironwood to sugar maple. I've never seen that. In fact, I've seen just the opposite. We have in some of our research trials, some of those tag seedlings, the deer rarely browse the ironwood, or some people call it hop hornbeam, and will always browse the sugar maple. So you've got the blessing of deer that are doing it wrong. So good for you. Did I understand your comment, Steve? I'm not. It looks like your microphone is open, but I'm not hearing you if you're talking. All right. So feel free to, you can type in another question, or maybe forget your microphone working. So Eric says, what species other than sugar maple are good in the sugar bush? Great question as it relates to diversity. Always when you think about what trees should be growing where, it depends on the soils. So we have, and there's always variation. So I shouldn't say always, usually there's variation. You can find areas where there's maybe a rock outcrop that comes, you may not see it, but it comes close to the soil surface. Those soils are thin, they tend to be a bit more drought prone. Or you have other areas where you have maybe some depressions, and they tend to accumulate higher moisture conditions. So both those high moisture and low moisture are poor places to try to grow sugar maple. And we have, for better or for worse, have some great examples that they are not, where this previous management I talked about favored sugar maple irrespective of soil conditions. And so in those areas where you have you have soils and site conditions that are not conducive to really thrifty sugar maple, essentially anything else that will grow there is what is good. So if you can grow aspen, that's good. Basswood is good. Cherry is good. Red oak is good. Usually, maple producers aren't excited about nut producing trees. Aesthetically, they're nice, and they can be valuable. So red oak and white oak can be valuable species, but because of the acorns, there's a sense that it supports squirrel populations that do nasty things to tubing systems, and so usually nut trees are not encouraged. We've also had issues with hemlock on two counts. One, the The cones that are produced by hemlock are a food source for red squirrels, which can damage tubing systems. And then the hemlocks also cast shade. And in the wintertime, all it takes is one hemlock tree to shade a tubing system in the wrong spot, and you get an ice dam, and all of the sap that's uphill, upstream from that ice block stays in the line. And our Arnott sugarbush is kind of in a valley, and so we don't usually get direct sunlight until 9 or 10 o'clock in the morning, and then we lose sunlight by 3 or 4 o'clock in the afternoon. And so that's not a lot of time to thaw out those lines because of the hemlock. So the answer to the question is whatever species will grow in the soil, but knowing that many maple producers tend not to favor conifers. Pine wouldn't be as bad as hemlock because hemlock will typically be lower to the ground, but too much pine can also create a lot of shade. And the nut trees are also often avoided.
Peter, there was another question from Wayne asking.
Yep. I just saw that. So sorry,
Okay.
Wayne, I missed that. So Wayne says, I have areas with maples that are approximately 50 years old, 40 feet tall, 6 to 8 inches in diameter, 10 feet apart with very small crowns. Are they too old and too tall to grow larger crowns if I release them? Not at all. In fact, this would be, this is a great time to do a thinning. So there's two ways you can do a thinning. So thinning is different than regeneration. And the basic kind of the split here is that with the regeneration, your efforts are focused on establishing the next age class of forest. And so you're manipulating the current forest, but it's deliberately to develop the next age class. With the thinning, the focus is the current age class of forest. So you're focused on those 50-year-old 6 to 8 inch diameter trees. One way to do that is what's called a crown thinning release or crop tree release. So you identify the best trees, like the cream of the crop trees, mark them so that you know that those are the best trees, put a blue ribbon on them, and then cut trees that are touching the crown of that crop tree. So the crop tree is long-term future crop. It's not like it's a corn crop and you're ready to cut it. It's like a forest crop and you're going to grow it for another many, many decades. So mark your crop trees, and then ideally you'll release, it's called releasing the crown. So you make that crown, release it from competition on at least 2 faces. So crown has 4 faces, and you pick 2 faces. They can be adjoining faces or opposing faces, and cut whatever tree is competing with your crop tree for sunlight. And this is going to be, potentially you may have to cut a maple tree, and that's why you're focusing on what's my crop tree. So that's a strategy, and you could do that, in a maple woods for a sugar bush. You might do that on 50 or 60 trees in an acre. So it's not doing it. You're not looking at every tree. You're just focusing on what are my best trees. Now the good news is that if you're releasing 2 or 3 sides for 6 to 8 inch trees, you could probably go up to 4 sides. But if you go up to 4, so I wouldn't, for those of you that have bigger trees, 14-inch diameter trees, I would not do a 4-sided release. I would, once you get above a 10-inch diameter tree, I would stop at probably 2 sides and then come back in a few years and do another side if you want. But on your crop trees, if you cut a couple of trees to release them, there are trees that are on the other side of that cut tree that are going to benefit from that release. So you get more than the benefit to just your crop trees. You get some collateral benefit, if you will. And these trees are big enough that if you use firewood for some reason, those are great trees for firewood. And the trees at 50 years old, they're going to respond well to release. In fact, we did a thinning in the Arnott, in a section of the Arnott Sugarbush. And this is one of the oldest sections of Sugarbush. We had trees that were 15 to 18 inches in diameter that we released, and they showed a growth response in the first year. So that was pretty exciting. So the other benefit, Wayne and others, is that as you thin and open up those trees, you'll retain the longevity in those lower branches. So as the tree gets taller, the proportion of the total stem that's in crown is going to increase. That's called the live crown ratio. And ideally, you're going to have, so if you look at a yard tree, a sugar maple yard tree, everybody loves them. You've got 80% live crown. And also you have nearly circular symmetrical crowns. When you get into the forest, you get competition. You may get, crowns that are narrow and elongated. And so, looking and seeing where that crown is suffering will give you an idea of where you're going to get a good response by providing additional sunlight.
And there's very few branches at the top of the tree, and it's just clean trunk all the way down.
Yeah.
At least 40 feet.
Yeah, so that was probably in a former agricultural field. It was abandoned. There was a hedgerow of sugar maple trees. They threw seed. This was before we had high deer impacts, and you had a very dense forest of sugar maples grow up. So you'll see, I think, a very positive response from those trees.
Okay.
And so I talked about crop tree management. There are other ways that's called an area-wide thinning. It's difficult to explain just by me talking, but if you go to the YouTube, youtube.com, let me type it in. I've got a YouTube channel where so youtube.com/Forest Connect is where I archive all of my webinars. We've done webinars since 2007 every month. And if you type in thinning, or probably thinning is the best one, there's some hour-long lectures with pictures on different types of thinning. So that'll give you an idea. And you can also get a hold of your state agency forester. Wayne, I think I saw you earlier. You're in New York, so you call the DEC and have a DEC forester come out and say, I'm interested in doing some thinning. Can you, help me, think through this? And sometimes they'll mark, they'll paint an acre as a demonstration to show you kind of what you should be doing, or you could work with a private consulting forester to mark trees. So it's 10 after 8. I want to be sensitive to everybody's evening. I'm happy to stick around and talk some more if there are more questions, but let me type my email in here. ejs23@cornell.edu. You're always welcome to send me an email, or Aaron and Adam emails, and we will do everything we can to help you with your questions.
One quick question, not to do with maples. Why do squirrels chew the ends off oak branches? The backyard is littered with the ends of oak branches. Do you have any clue as to why they do that?
No. I mean, that's my best answer. It's the most honest and thorough. I could speculate. I don't know. Adam, you've taken your microphone off. Do you have an answer that you want to give?
I do not.
That's
I've noticed that was.
Have
you guys seen it before too? I mean,
yeah.
They literally chew there's tons of them, and they just chew the ends. And I thought it was something that the tree just did by itself. And then I went and looked at them, and they're all chewed on. So,
yeah,
I don't know.
I would That's a Paul Curtis question. If I think of it, or if one of us thinks of it, we'll send Paul Curtis an email and see what he says.
I've seen it with other species of trees as well. I suspect it might be simply just rodent behavior, the chewing impulse that they have.
Well, it's better than chewing on tubing, right?
Absolutely.
That's how they sharpen their teeth so that they can.
Oh, so they do a better job on the tubing.
Yeah,
I
that's
get
right.
it. Yeah.
Yeah, there's no free lunch here.
Oh, one more thing on the, how small of a diameter DBH on the trees, like in a, how small can you do before you start thinning a small patch? I've got I got a small section and they're all about maybe 3 to 4 inches in diameter. I mean, can you still do crop tree, like pick the best one of the bunch and eliminate some of the other ones? Is that too small for that, or?
That is not too small. So the size limits on when you would start thinning depend largely on your the product that you want from your woods. So for timber, for woodland owners that are interested in timber, we'd recommend, just as Wayne had, something in the 6 to 8 inch diameter class. There you can at least get firewood out of it. So you can get a product and it offsets the cost of doing the work. He has also gone through, his woods have gone through that. It's a thinning process, a natural thinning. So some trees live and some trees die. You're earlier in that. So, or if you have, if the average tree diameter is 3 inches, and I think I said, Wayne might leave 50 or 60. I might go as high as 70 trees. It depends on how much work you want to do. For you, I would go above that and look more like 80 to 100 trees per acre. For 2 reasons. One is 10 years from now, those young trees, those crowns are going to expand very quickly. And you're going to go back in maybe in 5 years and do this process over again and continue to be, you're looking for the best trees. You don't have to, the purpose, this is for Wayne's situation and your situation, the purpose is not to go in and do what's called a bad tree witch hunt. You're not trying to cut all the ugly trees. You're focusing on what are my best trees and giving sunlight to the best trees. So you might do this now and then go in 5, just watch it. Those crowns will expand. And for that really young forest, I would try to open it, give about a 10-foot airspace on each side of the tree. And you will see those crowns are going to close. That canopy is going to close very quickly. But by having 80 or 100 trees per acre, then you can be more selective the next time around and say, okay, in 5 or 10 years, I'm only going to release 60 or 70 trees. And then so you just kind of increment your way. And then, how many trees per acre you want to tap if they're growing well, and then you can develop, you'll have very deep crowns because you're starting young and wide crowns. So those are going to be highly productive trees into the future. And you can do those, however, the crop tree, the cutting of the trees that are adjacent to your crop trees can be any way you want. It does not have to be pretty. If they're small enough and you have hand loppers and you lop them off at waist high, you've accomplished at least one part of the objective, which is to provide sunlight to your crop tree. Now, if you're in an area that gets a lot of snow like Adam is, and you've got a 3-foot high stub and you're out there on snowshoes, at some point you're going to get that stub down through the webbing of your snowshoe, and you're just going to walk in circles until spring when somebody comes to find you. So, be careful what you ask for, you might just get it. But, so it depends on how quickly you want to go through and do it. You could take your loppers, or, you could, if you're working with 3-inch trees, I would probably be inclined to do it with a hand saw, and I would cut it off at, whatever's comfortable to bend over. The stumps will sprout and the deer will browse the stumps, and then the stumps will die. So it doesn't, and you're not probably tapping trees amongst those 3-inchers.
No.
So if you have those dead stems around the ground, aesthetically, it doesn't look great, but it's not going to be of any harm. And within a couple of years, they'll rot down to the point that they're very brittle.
Excellent, thank you.
Sure.
Ground knives. We've got plenty of those in my woods.
What are they? Oh,
Ground knives. We call
Yeah.
them.
so.
They're
All
awesome.
right. Well, thank you all very much for taking some of your time on a Wednesday evening and talking about maple trees. It's a lot of fun. And thanks to Aaron and Adam. I think this is a great effort. I enjoy just being able to have a conversation. It's a lot of fun.
Thank you, Peter, for your time and your expertise.
All
Appreciate
right.
it.
Thank you.
all.
See you in a couple of
Adam.
weeks.
Yeah. So I will, Adam and Aaron, I will stop the